Well, I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm going to. Make sure that you're reading the passages that are listed there in your study guide, because again, I'm not going to take the time to read the Bible to you here on these videos. I'm going to be commenting on the passage, but nothing that I say is going to make any sense. And especially on this particular lesson chapter 8, which begins on page 27 of the study guide, entitled "The Shepherd, the Fool, and the Witch." Because these two passages I've listed, 1 Samuel 25 and 1 Samuel 28, are just extraordinarily vivid, powerful narratives and important events in the life of David and the history of redemption as it unfolds in the Bible. So we come to this rather strange and vivid story that we find in 1 Samuel 25. There's this man named Nabal. And it's important to understand that Nabal in Hebrew means fool. Nabal has this rich and beautiful possession that is his. He's wealthy. He's got a good spot in life. He's got a kind of Garden of Eden all to himself. He's got servants and flocks and herds. And yet his name is Fool. In other words, Nabal and his situation is rather like a microcosm of the story of Israel, or the situation of Israel as it now stands. It's a beautiful place. It's God's promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that God's given to his people, with great potential and promise. It's run by a fool. A fool is the king. And here comes God's true anointed, David. And David is protecting Nabal and his possessions and making sure that nothing comes to harm him, which, by the way, is exactly what David is doing for all of Israel. This whole story just runs as a microcosm of what's happening in the narrative. What is David doing in Israel? He's fighting off the Philistines. He's been negotiating with Israel's enemies. He's rescued and saved the king on more than one occasion. He's forming the new Israel of those who are going to be dedicated to God's anointed and bring the reign of God to bear and make Israel be what Israel is supposed to be. But the fool that runs the show, King Saul, the tyrant, has no interest in it and hates David. Well, that's exactly what happens with Nabal. There's a funny sort of connection here that if you look at the Hebrew letters, it's the same letters that are used for the word wineskin as Nabal's name. So Nabal is just like a big wineskin. That's all he's good for, is to consume wine. His little wisdom in him. And so David comes against Nabal when he's rebuffed. After doing all this service for Nabal, he is rebuffed by Nabal. And Nabal says, I couldn't care less who David is. And David comes with his armed men. I mean, he's got this posse of rugged, disaffected, upset people that will follow his command and his word. And they are not going to have a barbecue with Nabal. They are going to wipe him off the face of the earth. And Nabal's wife Abigail knows this. And she goes out to David as fast as she can. She saddles up the animals. She's got provisions for David and for his men. And she comes to him. And she reminds David of something. David has refused to kill King Saul when he had the opportunity to do so. Twice in the stories thus far. She reminds David that he must not deliver himself, but wait for God to deliver him. He must not raise his hand in violence. He is not bringing in the kingdom through killing the king, but by waiting upon the Lord. Because if he's God's anointed, God will give him his kingdom in due time. David's house, David's kingdom will prevail, she says, but David must not accede to the throne with blood guilt upon his head. He, in other words, must not be like Saul. See the parallels to our Lord? My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight, he tells Pontius Pilate, right? He's not there to kill all the bad guys and get rid of everyone. He's there to suffer. And through waiting upon God, his Father, God will in due time raise him up. And that's exactly what David must learn. What's beautiful and fascinating in this story is to watch the big picture of redemption going on here. Here you've got a woman, her name is Abigail, which means my father's joy. My father's joy is married to fool Nabal. Fool dies when he hears that his wife has sent provision to aid the men of David in defiance of his will. He has a heart attack and dies on the spot. She's released from the fool, and she goes to David, the beloved of God, and she becomes his bride, and she marries him, and he enters into his kingdom. I mean, if this isn't a type of Christ in his church, Christ comes to the one that is his Father's joy. Jesus says, all whom the Father has given me will come to me, and all who come to me I will in no wise cast out. And so he sends the Father's joy. The bride comes to the Son, and the bride is released from service to the fool that she has been married to. Paul talks about this in Romans 7. We've been married to sin, and when our spouse dies, we're free from that spouse of sin to which we've been betrothed and married all these years. And then we're married to another. We're married to our deliverer. Well, now we come to the last episode in the story of Saul. And this account in 1 Samuel chapter 28 is almost like an Edgar Allan Poe story, isn't it? It is so dark and chilling. It's a horror tale. It's atmospheric. It's ethereal. It's a descent into darkness, as I call it on page 28. Remember that Saul has been rebellious against God all of this time. He has rejected the prophet Samuel, and the prophet Samuel is now dead, but he wouldn't listen to the prophet Samuel in his lifetime. He always rejected Samuel's admonitions, and Samuel told him the kingdom would be torn from him. So he can't go to a prophet. There is really no prophet at this time with the death of Samuel. New prophets will be raised up, but at this time there is no prophet, and even if there were, why should Saul demand or have the privilege or right of consulting a prophet? He never listened to the one prophet he had. He can't go to the priests for help. He slaughtered them. The last remaining priest from the one village ran in terror and placed himself under David's protection. He can't seek God's anointed, to whom God is speaking, David, because he's opposed to him and he's tried to kill him. So where does he turn? Here's a quotation from the scholar Peter Leithart on page 28. No prophets could help, for as verse 3 reminds us, the chief prophet Samuel was already dead. The lack of priestly guidance was Saul's own fault, for he slaughtered all the priests who might have helped, and the ephod had gone to the side of David. The last remaining priest who had not been slaughtered but escaped that day brought with him the sacred vestment of the ephod. The passage includes yet another ironic twist on the punning with Saul's name. Verse 6 in 1 Samuel 28 in the Hebrew begins with Yish'al, Shu'ul, which are both variations on the verb to ask. That's what Saul's name means, Shaul, to ask. Saul was no longer the one that Israel was asking for, and Saul was no longer able to receive an answer to what he asked. And so he asked of, or to put it in modern English, he consulted a medium, a witch. In 1 Samuel 15:23, Samuel had warned Saul, rebellion against God is as the sin of witchcraft. It's dabbling in the dark arts. It's turning to the father of lies. It's walking away from the light. And that's exactly why Saul is in the place that he's in now. And he's headed to the house of a witch to consult a necromancer that will raise someone from the dead. Look at how this story is full of fear and darkness. It's nighttime. Everybody's afraid. Saul's afraid. The woman he consults is afraid. Fear is palpable. You can just taste it as you read the story. Again, to quote Peter Leithart, fear is one of the most important themes of the chapter of 1 Samuel 28. Saul was afraid. The woman he consulted was frightened when Samuel appeared. Saul assured her that she had nothing to fear, though Saul himself admitted he was distressed. When Samuel told Saul he would die, Saul became very afraid and terrified. Saul's fear had been growing in him since his initial sins. When Goliath taunted Israel, Saul and his men were greatly afraid and dismayed, and when Saul tried to kill David and failed, he began to fear. because he couldn't kill the thing that was his enemy, and he began to realize that David had the special protection of God upon him. Faced with another Philistine assault, Saul was again fearful. The repletion of fear and the intensification of the language to be afraid, to be very afraid, to be terrified, shows us the progressions of sin and unbelief. And a king gripped by fear is not the man you want fighting Israel's battles. In fact, he doesn't want to be recognized as the king. And the story goes out of its way to explain that that Saul tried to disguise himself when he went to the house. Robert Alter, the Hebrew scholar, puts it really well. He says, Saul disguises himself and put on different clothes. The narrative motivation is obvious, as the very ruler who has made necromancy, calling up spirits from the dead, a capital crime, Saul can scarcely come to engage the services of a necromancer unless he is disguised as a commoner. But his disguise also is the penultimate, the next to the last instance of the motif of royal divestment. Very important point. As we have seen, clothing is associated with Saul's kingship. Remember the robe? The robe that was torn, the robe of Samuel. When it was torn, Samuel said, so will your kingdom be torn from you. Remember that Jonathan took his robe off as heir to the throne and gave it to David, thus transferring ownership of the kingdom to David? Well, now Saul has divested himself of his royal robes and put on the clothes of commoners. As we have seen, clothing is associated with Saul's kingship. The torn or cut garment is the tearing of his kingship. Now, in an unwitting, symbolic gesture, he divests himself of his royal garments before going to learn of his own impending death. And so he goes. It's a strange and terrible story. People always say, did he really speak to Samuel? Was that really Samuel's spirit called up from the grave? Or was that a demon or whatever it was? Well, it sounds like Samuel, and here's why. Samuel had nothing good to say to Saul after he began disobeying the Lord. Not one good word, not one word of encouragement, only rebuke. And now that he's raised from his resting place, in desperation, as Saul calls him because he's about to go out and go to war with the Philistines, and he has no confidence in his ability to win the battle, Samuel still has nothing good to say to him and not one word of encouragement. But you know, there's something else here. Peter Leithart has pointed this out in the story, which is really terrifying. It sort of intensifies through symbolism the horror of what's going on. The story should be read, as I've got here in the notes, as a dark Passover, a sinister Passover. Remember the Passover? It's a great time of deliverance for God's people, also a time of great fear, because they were told what? The death angel will pass over. Only if you put the blood of the lamb on your doorpost will you be saved. What's going to happen to the Egyptians? All their firstborn will be killed. Death is coming to their land, right? For the Israelites, it was a good thing. What did they have to do? They had to be dressed, ready to go, eat their meal in haste, and eat unleavened bread. No time to leaven the bread. Unleavened bread, eat their meal in haste, and what? Get out of Dodge. Flee from Egypt. Go. Death is coming. Okay, that's what happened in the original Exodus. What's going on here? And who was struck down in the Exodus? Not Israel. Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the tyrant king. Pharaoh, the one who defied the God of Israel. Pharaoh that said that he could disobey God and somehow get away with it. Okay, what happens to Pharaoh? His firstborn gets struck down. Death comes to him. What's happening here? Israel's firstborn king is Saul. He's the first king of Israel, the firstborn of Israel, the head of Israel, the captain of the hosts. And the death angel is coming against him. Not against God's enemies, against him. It's absolutely terrifying. It's like an Exodus in reverse. I mean, imagine if the death angel had come and struck down the Israelites instead of the Egyptians. That's what's happening here. He's being told that he will die. David is the true Israel here in the story, God's son, God's anointed, and he's coming up out of the land of the Philistines, where he's been hiding out, like Egypt, to enter the promised land and to conquer it. So here comes Saul, the firstborn and king of Israel, and he's told the death angel will cut him down. He has taken the place of Pharaoh. He has become the un-Israelite. He is divested of everything that has to do with obedience and fidelity to the Lord. But David is going to come up out of the land of the Philistines, and through the death of Pharaoh, Saul, his kingdom will come, and he will be elevated. Now there's a clue in the story. That's why I really want you to make sure you've read these passages, because there's these little statements that we think are just sort of throwaway details that are so extraordinarily important. And it's brought out for you on page 30 of the study guide in this quote by Peter Leithart. Look at the meal that Saul eats in the house of the witch. Okay, he listens to Samuel after convincing the witch he's not going to kill her. She recognizes who he is. She screams in terror. Saul's afraid. She's afraid. Samuel is brought up from the dead, and Samuel tells Saul he's going to lose the battle and he's going to die. And at the end of that, wiped out, exhausted, at the end, spiritually and emotionally in every way, the witch offers him something to eat because he's wiped out. So here's what Peter Leithart says. Saul's meal at the medium's house is a good Old Testament example of a table of demons. Remember what Paul said in Corinthians? You can't partake of the table of demons and the table of the Lord, right? It's a table of demons, and Saul was there participating in a feast at the house of the dead. He shared, listen, in a counterfeit Passover, a meal of unleavened bread. It's specifically mentioned. Unleavened bread in the dark of night, which, like Passover, took place at night. This Passover was no benefit to him, but it was still preparation for an exodus. During the following day, Saul died in battle. The Lord destroyed the firstborn Saul and thereby enabled the true Israel, David, to come up out of Egypt and to enter into his kingdom. It's a terrible, terrible end to a sad and tragic reign. But Saul is exactly what we all are, and exactly what Israel was so many times, those who are trying to take dominion and run the show and succeed in our endeavor, pursuing our own agenda in defiance of God's will and defiance of God's way. The one we should be attached to is David. Let us be like those debt slaves and disaffected and disenfranchised people who are outside the pale of traditional society and flee from the tyranny of Saul and run to David, because his kingdom is come and his kingdom will prevail. Amen.